What is the funniest word?
Gorgeous, baby. You're gorgeous.
This is the Josh Podcast Show, the anti-podcast podcast on God and man. The show that everybody's talking about. The show that will become a necessary part of your weekly mental diet. The show that picks up where joshrolf.com leaves off. The show title that uses the word podcast 4 times. Introducing your host, Josh Rolf.
What is the funniest word? It's a tough question to answer. And I needed an answer. I looked far and wide. I traveled the 4 corners of the earth. I searched everywhere I could possibly search, and I did it with tremendous speed. Instead of talking to people, I went to Google. The first search result led me to the Alpha Dictionary list of 100 words. After skimming through the lengthy list, I left unimpressed, although gastromancy was interesting. Gastromancy is a niche fortune-telling method that takes readings from stomach rumblings. From gastromancy, I clicked to Merriam-Webster, the well from which all words spring, where they offered 10 of the funniest words, but none of those words was, to me, satisfactory. Each word, like bumfuzzle, was too obscure. I was looking for something a little different. I didn't care about the sound of the word. I wanted a word we use in common, everyday speech, a word we use so frequently we don't even realize how funny it actually is. Quora, the site that puts these kinds of questions to regular people, was my last resort. After a minute skimming the responses, exhausted from my search, I left Quora more than a little disappointed. Stomach rumbling. Then one day, I'm not sure exactly when or where, it all came to me. On my podcast, in episode 13, which you should stop listening right now, go back to episode 13, give it a whirl. In that episode, I announce my finding to all the world. The funniest word in human language is so worthy of the funniest word title that it gets its own episode in episode 13, which is also the shortest podcast episode ever recorded. Yes, I had discovered the funniest word, but was this podcast episode really the shortest ever recorded? I turned again to the internet. My search for the shortest podcast world record resulted in finding a podcast episode that was 35.94 seconds long. As I point out in the description of episode 13, my first podcast episode at 27 seconds, meaning my first podcast episode, episode number 1, is only 27 seconds, easily beats that record. If you have 27 seconds to spare, you can listen to that record-breaking podcast by stopping now, going. I know I'm giving you a lot of homework today, but you can do this. I think you're capable. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm definitely 99.9% sure that episode 13 is, in fact, still, even 2 years later, the shortest podcast episode ever recorded since the dawn of the podcast medium. I would also venture to say that no radio episode, which is the forefather to the podcast, and no phonographic record, the forefather to radio, and not even any archaeoacoustic discovery, the forefather to the phonograph, was ever as short as my podcast episode number 13. I don't want to brag, but the entire episode from beginning to end of episode 13 clocks in at just 0.9 seconds. I admit someone could now record at 0.8 seconds and beat me, but I'm convinced I have the edge because the word I say is the funniest of all the clean words in human language. The funniest word in human language, the one that I recorded on episode 13, the one that is 0.9 seconds long, the word that is not offensive, dirty, vulgar, obscene, or gross, the word you used at least several times just today. Brace yourself. I have now completely prepared you. It's the word well. If you have 1 second to spare, go back, listen to episode 13 if you haven't already, and you will hear how I say the word well, which is important. I should also add that I wanted to record the funniest word that is only 1 second long. Semicolon is one of my favorite funny 2-second words. Pizzazz, which I talked about last week in the previous episode, is another of the over a second variety. When you read the word well or hear it, I already know what you're thinking. Well is not a funny word, Josh. It's just not funny. It never will be funny no matter how much you try to convince me. Well, I think it is. And that's the reason I'm talking about it today. I completely understand if you disagree. If you did a podcast episode telling me that well is the funniest word, I would not have agreed with you either. Well, it turns out, is one heck of a complicated word. There are many meanings of well, and not many of them are funny, so you are mostly correct. For example, there's the Jack and Jill well used to fetch a pail of water. We can agree that the water well is not the funny type of well. The most funny thing I can think of with a traditional water well, and I'm being absolutely straight with you here, is the well would have to somehow be used in an unexpected way. What if, for example, the well was the only way to get water to brush your teeth at bedtime? Mom, I'm going to the well to brush my teeth. Yes, dear, but remember to check the bucket for mold. That's not really funny. Or how about this? What if, when bringing up the bucket from the bottom of the well, it brings up a kitchen sink instead, with a working faucet, disposal, and all? That's kind of funny and unexpected. I'm not good at this. Maybe you can think of something funny. I'm sure you can. My point is, the water well is not the well I'm talking about, so let's move on. In other uses of well, there's the one that implies, let me explain that to you. Josh, help me understand your podcast. Well, have a seat. A little funny. Not much, though. Except if you like jokes taken at my expense, which are actually 90% of my jokes, and arguably the raison d'être for this entire blog and podcast. I defy anyone to tell me how having a Josh podcast show is doing myself any favors, which leads me to my earth-shattering conclusion that well is definitely a funny word. There are a lot more uses for well. Some are funnier than others. There's the, I hate to break this to you, well, there's good news and bad news. That is akin to the have a seat well. Well, we're out of cheese. Only said with a little regret and having to share what will follow. The difference is the have a seat version is said with an upswing, and the hate to break it to you version, a downswing. There's also the hesitant well said with a sideward swing, as if the L sound would carry on forever. Well, as I learned from iTunes reviewer of my podcast, Retro Keith, my use of well is one that would have made the early television comedian Jack Benny proud. I wasn't familiar with this, so I did a search and found that one of Benny's better-known lines was, well. This find, you can imagine, made me crazy impressed with myself. Here I am, This random guy who thinks the funniest word is also one used, speaking of forefathers, by the forefather of modern comedy. The only problem with the Benny comparison is I didn't say well exactly as he used it. Well, with an exclamation point, has a few meanings. One definition makes it similar to saying, how dare you? Well. Or the other meaning behind well is, I'll be darned. Like, well. And there's also the exasperated well that means I'll be, that goes, well. Now allow me to explain the well that was said on episode 13 of my podcast. The well I used was the question well. The question well is the most dramatic of all the wells. It can be said in a few different ways. Within the spectrum of question wells, the least funny is the impatient, will you make up your mind well that goes, well. The funnier well is the previous one, only used in a way that sounds less, well, impatient. Well, the funniest well, in my humble opinion, is one that is hardly ever used because of its dramatic nature. The word starts at the bottom of the Adam's apple, continuing down through the upper chest cavity before advancing upward along the throat and almost hitting the roof of the mouth, arching and de-arching the tongue throughout. Of every single well, and well, it's a true feat to say the question well, and it's almost always worth it. And here's how it's said. Well, the meaning of the funniest question well is implied here. Well, don't you think this word is the funniest 0.9 second word in all of human language? Yeah? Yeah? I can't make this up. I seriously just made all this up. I've thought about well more than you. Well, I guess we're done now. In that well, the way I just used it, I say it using the definition that is never, ever, ever funny. It's just rude. We use it to end a conversation. The one who says it knows it's rude, and the listener knows it's rude, but it's still perfectly acceptable to use in speech and toward the end of long-winded podcast episodes. So here is the power of well. We're done here. I don't know why you're still listening. I don't know why I'm still talking, but there are many other wells. I just don't feel like talking anymore. But I'm going to do it anyway. So here are a few more. The I'm going to disagree with you well, that goes like this. Well, there's the encouraging well. Well, there's the I made up my mind well. Well, there's the speak up well. Well, there's the confused well. Well, I got a speaking second wind just now. That's the power of well too. The do you have an opinion well. Well, the well, that goes like this. Well. I love that one, actually. The answer to how are you doing? Well. The giving up. Oh, well, that goes, oh, well. The I don't like my steak well done well, that goes, rare. There's the well, you don't say. There's the well then. I'm sure there's others. Wells Fargo is kind of funny. Then there's all the well-trained, well-written, well-heeled, well-being, well-tested, well-made, well-hyphen words, none of which are at all funny. And a good reader of my blog at joshrolf.com, when I first wrote this all out, reminded me of some I forgot. The I don't feel well, wellness well, and the well.
Thank you for listening to the Josh Podcast Show, the anti-podcast podcast on God and man. For more information, visit joshpodcast.com. Follow Josh on Twitter at Josh Rolf. That's Rolf, R-O-L-P as in podcast, H. Now go and have the best day and night ever. And have fun. Thank you for listening to the Josh Podcast Show, the anti-podcast podcast on God and man. For more information, visit joshpodcast.com. Follow Josh on Twitter at Josh Rolf. That's Rolf, R-O-L-P as in podcast, H. Now go and have the best day and night ever. And have fun.